Welcome to What Would Sabrina Say? I'm Sabrina Dong, and I'm excited you're joining me today. In this podcast, I dive into mental health topics on relationships, and overall well-being. With over 20 years of experience as a licensed clinical social worker, I share insights and invite expert guests who are passionate about making a positive difference. I started this podcast because I was frustrated with the often misleading or recycled information in social media involving self-help and the mental health field. My goal is to provide you with genuine, useful content that's educational and informative. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you find our conversations both enlightening and empowering. I'm glad you're here. Thanks for joining me today. This is Ellis. We're excited to talk about mindful teaching practices, meditation, yoga. Lots of people often wonder about the difference between, so I'm excited to have you today just to share your insights and expertise. Let's talk about yourself and your practices in business. Excited to hear more.
Yeah, I'm the founder of MindMo Wellness Company, which is still in an earlier stage of business, but the intention behind MindMo is really to provide high quality online education and training for really wellness professionals, but also people who are just interested in learning about different holistic modalities for wellness. Right now, the main offering we have is a mindfulness teacher training. It's accredited and it's an online training. And that is a big part of my work right now, is just building that business. We're wanting to include other trainings in the future. There's a lot of colleges out there that offer programs in different wellness modalities. And then there's other online offerings. And I feel like there's so much interest and growth in the wellness space that there's so many people out there who learn either for their own well-being or to support others in their community. So that's a big focus of mine right now, just building up that business. And in terms of myself and my background, a lot of my professional experience and training has been centered around mindfulness. So forms of mindfulness meditation, breathing, breathwork practices. I'm also a yoga teacher, but in terms of yoga, I've never really been into the physical practice as much as more of utilizing the breath, focusing on the breath. And then I also am a grad student. I'm researching right now mindfulness, specifically how it can support university students. And a big part of my research right now is on how mindfulness and holistic wellness programs can support Jewish university students. A part of my life right now too is just also academic studies. I think that's kind of a pretty good overview. I guess the other thing I would say is I've always been very interested in entrepreneurship, and I really feel like creating services and products is a great way of providing support and healing in the world. So I'm working on a few other entrepreneurial things at the moment too.
Amazing. I think that technology is such a great way to have mindfulness be accessible. And there's lots of research happening through psychologists like Zendel Siegel to see about the effects, the benefits that you can still get from it. I personally enjoy different platforms and apps in my own mindful practice on the go.
Mhm.
Active walking meditations. And back to what you shared about your courses and being one of the instructors, I really appreciate how you focus on the ethics of mindful teaching and the accreditation piece. I think that's really important, and that has people stand out from the rest. So I'm wondering if you could share more about that accreditation and the difference maybe between that versus another program.
I would say that once you start getting into programs out there that are more expensive, much more expensive than the one that we're offering, usually they'll have probably some sort of accreditation, but there's definitely a lot of programs out there that aren't accredited. And sometimes they may just be associated with the Yoga Alliance or something like that. Our program is accredited through the International Mindfulness and Meditation Alliance, and then also it's going to be providing continued education hours for people who are associated with the Yoga Alliance. And I think that accreditations matter, but ultimately, I think the biggest thing is like what education and standards are being set for people who are going through any training so that they clearly understand these are the standards that I need to abide by. And these are the things I need to understand if I want to go on and teach. And I would say in the yoga and mindfulness spaces, a lot of people who do trainings don't even go on to teach, they just take the trainings. But for people who do go on to teach, I think it's really important for them to understand scope of practice, how to refer, when to refer. I think with scope of practice, one thing that's usually thought of is just, okay, well, where are my limits when discussing things related to mental health? But also when it comes to mindfulness practices, what are the limits when it comes to spirituality and religion? Because I think it can easily become sort of religious in some situations. And I think that that's something that's not talked a lot about in the mindfulness space, whereas I think the ethics in the mental health area are talked about more. So I think that's just the thing for me is trying to make sure there's the most amount of harm always avoided. And I think just having people who go through any training understand how to avoid the most harm and like what standards are being set is just like important.
Exactly. I thought maybe if you were interested in sharing about your own mindful practice day to day and what that's all about. So, not only is important around scope of practice as a mindful meditation teacher and understanding that, but also having it as part of your lifestyle, right? The mindfulness
Mhm.
meditation. And just wondering if you would like to share how you incorporate it in your day to day, what that looks like.
Yeah, so for me, every day I'll do some breath work practices, and maybe we'll get into this. The conversation around breath work, mindfulness meditation, like what is constituted as mindfulness practice. I think there's a lot of that's a very interesting question. I personally consider really any practice that is centered around developing a sense of presence could be considered a mindfulness practice, in my opinion, but I start with breath work practices and then do some form of just mindfulness meditation, usually where I'm just watching my breath. I would say that's usually 15 to 20 minutes. And then I have my own spiritual slash religious practices that I'll do after that. Sometimes I'll also do what I call mindful journaling, which is just basically reflecting on what's present internally, being present with certain feelings, and then potentially just writing about those feelings or whatever thoughts are arising. But I would say for me, the main thing historically has just always been focused on being present with with my breathing. I've practiced that for 13 years, pretty much every single day, if not more. That to me has really drastically changed my life early on. I think now, since I've practiced it for so long, I don't always notice how different I may be with if I wasn't doing it because I'm consistently doing it. But it definitely influences every aspect of life. I would say the main things for me is just being more controlled in how I respond to thoughts and emotions when they arise, also more focus and presence in life. And that was apparent to me when I started being able to really read books. Before I started practicing meditation, I would always have to reread parts of books. And it would be because I would read like a paragraph, then start thinking about something else. And then I'd be like, oh, I have to reread that because I don't really remember what just happened. And I noticed that probably 4 months or so after practicing consistently that I would be able to consistently be focused on what I was reading. And I feel like that focus just applies to any aspect of life. So that's, I would say, an overview of what I typically would practice and how it's impacted my life. I usually will also practice at night too.
Right. It does really help to regulate, to restore, right, for the
Yeah.
to be present there.
Yeah.
So it's certainly more than just breathing. I think sometimes that tends to be the idea that it's just breathing, pushing thoughts out, not
Hmm.
having any thoughts. But when it isn't, it's just not doing anything with them, which can and getting, like you hear lots of mindful practitioners say, getting comfortable with the uncomfortable, right? So
Hmm.
turning towards things. And even myself, my own experience I had was healing from pneumonia while facilitating a mindfulness-based cognitive therapy group.
Hmm.
My mentor, who's also a co-facilitator, said, just go with it, see what happens instead of just canceling for that session altogether.
Hmm.
And I did. And I noticed as I went into the practice, feeling less discomfort, feeling less pain, less worry about, oh no, how am I going to perform in front of people or sit through this long meditation, and just going with that flow and seeing where things are at. It was amazing how I was able to practice as per usual despite healing. So it is a really great tool to be able to not have things kind of intensify because our mind is on it so much.
For sure. And I think that one of my favorite teachers and researchers in the mindfulness space is Shauna Shapiro. And because I think she includes this element of self compassion and kindness in mindfulness, which ultimately, at the end of the day, I think when we talk about words that are used in any instruction, really any word is just guiding us towards kind of trying to embody an energy through intellectually understanding what the word means. And I think sometimes that word of their expression of non judgment in mindfulness can be confusing to some people. I still use it a lot, but I think some people also need to hear that kindness or self compassion element, because if we approach a practice with, like, "Oh, I'm sitting down to meditate and I'm gonna force myself through all this stuff and I'm gonna just sit here and it's gonna be tough and I'm gonna feel better at the end," it just is approaching it with this energy that can almost, in my experience, just compound feelings of insecurity and low self-worth, and then it just makes the experience more, I don't know what the right word would be, there's more activity, there's more thoughts, there's more emotions arising, and it just kind of keeps growing and growing. Whereas if we can sit down and witness what's arising and not fight, and we can kind of offer a sense of kindness to it without getting caught up in it, then typically I think the experience becomes more mindful, and it also becomes really like a more enjoyable practice. Not that it always has to be enjoyable. And it allows us to, I think, then in other moments of life when we may notice those difficult feelings coming up, instead of just instantly pushing them away or fighting, we have that moment of just being like, oh, it's okay. It's just a feeling or it's just a thought. And I think that's really helpful for the way that we work with thoughts and feelings.
Right. It's just letting go of an outcome and that doing mode all the time and expectations or results, right? It's all
Yeah.
about the process and being comfortable about going into our bodies and noticing
Mhm.
what's happening there too. I think we're all kind of walk around like floating heads, just very deep in our thoughts, next steps, what we need to do, tasks. And so, what I appreciate of a mindful practice is that it has us just kind of go into and notice how we're feeling and paying attention to the rest of us as a whole versus just being very thought oriented.
Mhm. One of the, it's not really like an attitude of mindfulness, but one thing that sometimes I'll say before my own practice is I don't have anything to do. There's nothing I need to do or figure out right now, because I think, at least for me, that's the way that my mind works, is it's always thinking about something that needs to be accomplished or changed or adjusted. Like you said, when we can just sit down and just be present, it's so relaxing, and it's so rare for so many of us to have a moment of just allowing ourselves just to be. without thinking there's something we need to be doing or changing. And those moments are like a vacation, a mental vacation.
Very much. I think we wait until vacations to relax, to unwind, to be in the present, or
Yeah.
it's about we're very much productive focused society,
Hmm.
right? So it feels like I'll have to do all this, then I can relax, or that's being lazy if you kind of sit around. Or when I say to people, have you ever tried looking out a window and seeing how you feel? I kind of laugh or scoff,
Hmm.
right? Because it's why would I do that? That's just something that's boring.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so it's very much about being in the present and just noticing our surroundings, noticing what's happening for our bodies. And it's not just about breath. That's certainly a way to kind of anchor. And I'm wondering if you'd like to share. You mentioned being able to focus and it sounds like read differently or better with practicing. Anything else that you've maybe experienced over the 13 years?
Yeah. I would say that I think the main thing is the sense of presence that comes from it and the presence of what is arising versus just unconsciously being guided by thoughts or emotions without any space. And the Viktor Frankl quote of like in between stimulus and response, there's a space. In that space is our opportunity to choose. And in that response is our freedom or something. Like it's something like that. I always have resonated with that quote because of how it relates to my experience with mindfulness practices because that space has helped me so many different ways. I think one of them is just feeling more comfortable in who I am as a person because witnessing thoughts and emotions from a distance has helped me realize, like, okay, these are thoughts, these are emotions. I don't necessarily have to believe this. I don't necessarily have to act on it. And I don't necessarily have to think that that thought is related to who I am. And I think in my late teens, like when I was 18 is when I started meditating around then. I really did not feel that way. Like I felt that my thoughts were the most accurate representation of who I was. That space really helped me to just kind of understand almost energetically who I feel like I am at a deeper level. And then I would say focus and concentration have been big elements of improvement. And not only just reading, but when I would study for a test or if I was doing some sort of homework assignment, I was able to, if I tried hard, I would pretty much always be able to get an A in a class. I don't know if this is just because of my brain development and getting older, but when I was younger, I feel like either just didn't care enough, and maybe that's why I didn't always get great grades. But I really do feel like it was focus as well, just not being able to consistently focus on something deeply. And I noticed that after practicing mindfulness meditation, I it was easier for me to do well in school. Also, I just think speaking, I don't consider myself an amazing speaker, but I feel like if I am in a decent mental state, I can usually explain my thoughts better than before I had practiced these things because I feel like I can kind of witness what feels right to say and then express it in a more efficient way. I think then it just also opened me up to a lot of other interests in my life. I think those are some of the main benefits for me. But what Dan Harris says about being 10% happier through mindfulness meditation, and that's something I'm wanting to incorporate more in uh, courses and trainings because I think one of the things that can happen is we start to have some positive improvements in our life from any sort of holistic or wellness practice and we start to become obsessed with it and we think, oh, if I just meditate for 7 hours a day, then all these other problems will go away. And that doesn't happen. And it can actually lead to negative consequences, I think, in situations like that. And so I try to treat any of these practices nowadays as just like these are tools and they address certain things and other things are more supportive of other aspects of life and wellness.
Right. And I had pleasure, sitting in on a joy conference or summit, and they talked about the difference between happiness and joy. And Sharon Salzberg
Mm,
was there, right?
mm,
Who practices mindful meditation, loving kindness. And it was really helpful to hear from her and other experts about the difference between happiness comes from external, outside, joy, content that comes from internal. And I
mm.
think that's easier to tap into as part of a mindful practice is that content, joy, and feeling that during your practice and not really seeking anything out, not material things, not objects. Nothing's changed, but yet we might notice that difference in our mood. So, like you said, really using it as a tool.
Mhm.
And again, not focusing on the outcome. I'm doing this to be happier. I'm doing this to not have any thoughts in my mind. It's more again as a way to reduce, but also as matters as much as you practice like anything else, right? Like
Yeah,
going to the gym.
I like that perspective on the difference between joy and happiness. That's nice.
Yeah, it really helped me. And I think it's helpful too, because a lot of times people feel, I want to achieve that. I want to attain it. But it's like
Mm,
any other emotion. You feel it, but it's short term.
yeah.
All the other feelings too. So it was a really great conference to sit in and hear about that difference and being okay as human beings to not be happy all the time. And again, the purpose of mindfulness is not to achieve that. For my own practice, it helps me to regulate emotions. For you might have been, not wanting to be driven by your thoughts. For me, it was not wanting to be driven by my emotions and finding it as a way to regulate them.
How would you feel like you were driven by your emotions?
Being more reactive.
Mm. In the moment, responding emotionally without feeling like you had the ability to choose a different response, kind
This
of.
is how I feel, so it must be true, right?
Mm,
Almost like this is what I'm thinking, so it must be true reality. If for me, I'm frustrated by this, behavior, by the situation. So it must be how I'm perceiving it and experiencing and feeling it.
yeah,
Right. So again, no pause, that knee jerk kind of reaction. And being really helpful to not sweat the small stuff. I kind of see it as it's a camera lens that I was able to widen and look at the bigger picture landscape where emotions maybe sometimes has you look through that little pinhole.
yeah. That's a good way of putting it. Yeah.
So with mindfulness, I'm sitting up there on a big cliff and I'm able to kind of look at the scenery or the view versus maybe right being in front of the boulder and not noticing anything else, right? So
Yeah.
the practice has really helped me in that way, and regulating emotions. I used to not be a believer about breathing and breath, just like, sure, that's what people talk about, whatever, right? Sounds hokey. We all breathe every day.
Yeah.
When you practice it and it's not all about that, you kind of learn it's with intention, it's bringing
Yeah.
awareness. And again,
Yeah.
that bigger
That's
picture.
that's a good that is interesting. I feel like what I usually hear with mindfulness practices is people think it's just about getting rid of thoughts. What could really happen with changing your breath? But I do think it makes sense to consider mindfulness meditation that way too. But it is so much, I think, about just developing focus and presence. And it just happens to be that the breath is the most accessible object to focus on. But I think really any object could work as an object of focus. And it's really, yeah, about that sense of presence and focus that we're training. And then the way we're responding to things that arise. If people hear mindfulness described that way, they're like, okay, that makes sense. It's like this mental training in a way.
Yes.
If it's described as, yeah, you're just that's not like a very thorough
No.
explanation. Yeah.
I mean, mindfulness, it's been more popular since 2010. But it's again about being more present, being more aware, having a thought that you're intentionally creating that's just not so automatic or feeling out of control or doing everything on autopilot. That's how I see mindfulness as lifestyle. And like you said, breathing is kind of the tool to be an anchor, could be another kind of object. So I'm wondering if you wanted to also talk about yoga and the difference there.
Yoga itself has so many different expressions. So many people define yoga differently. And from my like academic studies of yoga, what I've learned is like that's okay. And that's always the way that yoga has been. Like if you look at yoga historically, yoga has changed based on the culture. It's yoga is mostly associated with India and different expressions of Hinduism originally, but it would always change and adapt to whatever culture or sect that was practicing it. And in the Western world, when it's transformed into so many different expressions, I think that that's actually a really cool thing. Some people who are very into yoga think that it's a negative thing, that some people just think of yoga as physical exercise, which I can understand. But personally, for me, if that's helping them, it's improving their wellness and mental health. Like, I don't see a problem with that. I think that's a good thing. Maybe they would have never done those if it was presented in a way that it was like this super spiritual thing associated with Indian religions. Maybe the 60-year-old woman from the suburbs would have never ever went in and practiced it, and she would have never gotten some of those benefits. So like I think it's a good thing that it has all these different expressions, but in terms of what it is, I think that the traditional definition of what yoga is would be this eight-limbed system that's associated with Patanjali, who is associated with the Yoga Sutras. And this is, in a way, you could think of it as like a spiritual system, and it includes ethical guidelines, breathing, meditation, postures, all these different things in this system. But I would say yoga today is a secular practice that is usually associated with using postures, using breathing, and sometimes classes will have meditation. Usually, I would say classes are just pretty much focused on postures and maybe some breathwork practices or pranayama practices. But I would say that that's how I would describe yoga today, is that it's a secular practice, a holistic practice that uses postures, breathing, and potentially meditation. Mindfulness is the way that I describe it to people, is that it's just a practice of being, or the quality of being present. It is obviously very strongly associated with MBSR and John Kabat-Zinn's work. And I think because of that, so much of the research is associated with mindfulness-based stress reduction. So a lot of people, when they hear mindfulness, especially healthcare providers, only think about MBSR. And I personally think that now mindfulness is a much more expansive field and term. And it's not just associated with these secularized Buddhist forms of meditation. It's now with apps like Calm and Headspace, it's really expanded into this field of practices to generate a state of presence. Traditionally, we definitely, I think, would want to say that it is associated with these practices that have been researched through people like John Kabat-Zinn, that typically would involve this non-judgmental focus on the breath or like the body. And then breath work is usually controlling the breath. And so with traditional mindfulness practices, with mindful breathing, we're not controlling the speed of the breath. Whereas breathwork practices, usually we are controlling the speed of the breath. So in a yoga class or just a regular breathwork class, usually the breath is going to be controlled at a specific like speed or a way. And sometimes there may be an element of generating a specific emotion while using the breath. A traditional mindfulness meditation session would typically involve this non-judgmental focus on the breath, which isn't controlled. So I think really my opinion is that technically mindfulness meditation, most breathwork practices and most forms of yoga could be considered a mindfulness practice. However, once you get really technical, I think the difference between breathwork and mindfulness can sometimes be considered that breathwork is more of a controlled breathing. Mindfulness meditation is more of an uncontrolled breathing with more of this non judgmental piece. And then yoga has more of a physical movement component. I think for the sake of making things simple, when I describe it to people or if we're releasing courses, I try to help people understand that any of these things can be a mindfulness practice because you're consciously attempting to bring your mind back to the present moment, and you do have like an object that you're focusing on. However, when you get really technical, there can be some differences.
Yes, I enjoy practicing yoga to get deeper stretches, posture. I enjoy restorative yoga as well. It helps to restore our body, almost like sleep at that same state at the cellular level. But yes, it's more about using your breathing as a technique or tool to kind of go deeper into the postures. Where mindfulness at times breath is it's about release, softening, letting go of things, using it to explore your body and using it as like a home base or tool or anchor. The other way is more to get deeper into the postures and poses.
That I think that the same way I feel about mindfulness in, for instance, John Kabat-Zinn's work. I know some people who are more on the Buddhist side of things aren't into how the practices have become detached from Buddhism. But for me, it's the same way I feel about yoga becoming more detached from religion is that ultimately, at the end of the day, we have to acknowledge the history and pay respect to influences, certainly. But if it's helping people who would not be helped if it was more of this traditional form, I think that's a good thing. And I think most people who are in these practices and professionals in these fields for the right reason, I think ultimately they should just be concerned about providing support and positive transformation and avoiding harm. And so I think that similarly, like with mindfulness now, I think it's a good thing that mindfulness is becoming this very mainstream term. And all these people have never really looked into any of these more ancient traditions are developing what they call mindfulness practices where they may be journaling and being present with their journaling, being present with some breathing in the morning, and mindfulness has become this more expansive field. I personally think that while there's definitely, you could have some academic criticism of how it's being described, I think it's a good thing that it's become so kind of mainstream and expansive.
Yes, definitely. There's so many benefits that and research too, and like you said, it's reaching many more people, combining it with psychology, understanding how it benefits us, mind and body. Now with technology, expanding it even further.
Hmm.
Of course, people, if they're maybe more focused on the spiritual part of things, it's a whole spectrum.
Yeah.
Was wondering if you want to talk about your research too. So you shared how it's benefited your own life in having a mindful meditation practice, but your research involving students, how do you see students benefiting? What have you noticed in kind of preparing for your own research?
Yeah. So what I've found so far through a lot of meta analysis and just different research that's out there, it's definitely similarly to adults, supportive of students' mental health. Similar things that you would find in just like the research from John Kabat-Zinn. But I think what's unique about university students is that there's a lot of research showing how there's so much anxiety and stress, depression specifically for university students now. From what I've seen, it does show that there's been increase over time in those issues and challenges for students. I'm not so well versed where I can say over time it's been this change, but regardless, there's a unique challenge for college students in those areas. And additionally, I'm specifically doing work to support, through a program, support Jewish university students, and there's unique challenges to that population on top of already being college students. So the goal is really to create a program that is acknowledging those unique challenges and make a program that is really accessible, because university students are very busy, and to ask university students to take 20 minutes out of their day to do breathing practice and mindfulness meditation, it's just kind of unlikely that a lot of them will do that. So my goal is to provide very accessible practices that students can use in a small period of time over an 8-week period, and basically cover things like mindfulness meditation, simple breathwork practices they can do, cover mindfulness as it relates to technology too, ways to be mindful about social media usage, using the phone, potentially mindful walking and mindfulness in nature. I think the idea right now is to have it be an online program, so I don't that might be a little bit challenging. But basically, the research out there is showing that university students are struggling with their mental health. Mindfulness practices have been shown to support university students and also adults. Now, my plan is to just try to design a program that is going to address all those specific challenges well. And yeah, hopefully it will help.
For sure. When you think of also students who are athletes and needing to juggle expectations in different areas, right? And the stressors and pressures there of trying to carry on academically, but plus, different practices that they need to do for their sport. It would be great to have this accessible tool, however briefly, just be more present and just less driven by tasks that
Yeah.
happen when we get caught up in the day to day.
Yeah. And I'm excited to explore more research around mindfulness with technology. And I think that's such a big thing for university students in general. It's true that social media can provide connection, but the risks of constantly using the phone and social media, it's just so many challenges that come from that. So I think that's a big thing, especially now, but moving forward too, for younger generation. How is there going to be more mindfulness around how technology is used?
Mhm.
And then, yeah, definitely just having practices that can be accessed at any time and can be done in a short period of time. Ideally, yeah, you would have the ability to sit down for 15 minutes or so and do these things. But if you don't, what is something you can do in 5 minutes? Is that going to be beneficial mentally and emotionally? There's research out there about practices that are shorter still having benefits. That's what my thought is right now, is how can these practices be as accessible as possible? So what is going to be something that's practical for them?
Yeah, I remember as a student, for me, I was always juggling several different jobs. And then you want a social life. You just felt pulled in all directions. So it'd be great to see how mindfulness can be incorporated and help students in some
Yeah.
of those benefits, whether it's helping to focus, feel less overwhelmed, regulating emotions. So look forward to hearing more about your research.
Me too. I'm excited to see what comes from it. I'm still in the early stages of reviewing research, but I also am speaking with leaders, colleges, to really try to understand more in detail what are the actual problems they're seeing in real life too, so that those can be really addressed. Because I think sometimes you can just look at stuff that's out there and be like, oh, these are the problems that exist, but it maybe in reality that's not an accurate in terms of what's really happening.
And there's so many wait lists for counseling student services on campus. It'd be great, again, to have a program that's accessible while people are waiting for supports and seeing the difference too. So there's lots of
Yeah.
ways you could research.
I'm also interested in exploring uh, how having coaching options could also potentially be something that could support university students. If like you said, if there's so much demand for counseling, maybe wellness programs that are a combination of some of these things like mindfulness, potentially coaching. I think there's a lot that can be explored. And for how much university students are paying, they for sure deserve more support for their mental health challenges. I'm excited to see what will come from it.
That's great. I know we talked about sort of what's trending, words like mindfulness, wellness. I wondered if we could touch too on what holistic means to you and how that can be applied.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that to me, holistic means addressing all aspects of oneself and one's wellness. I think when people think of holistic wellness, they're thinking of things like acupuncture, things like yoga, maybe some forms of nutritional work, or mindfulness, breathing. I think that most people associate holistic wellness with those practices. But for me, when I think about how I would define holistic wellness, it would be so the physical, mental, the mind body connection, the social, spiritual. We have to leave up to the person to address that area. But I think those are really like all of the areas: the physical, the mental, the relationship between the two, the spiritual. Yeah, I think that's how I think of it.
Right. So, like, if you were to go to a doctor with a stomach ache and they're just focused on the stomach, okay, let's see is there anything happening that could cause that response? Is it finding out the person's stressed or it's about finances or et cetera? So,
Right.
it's kind of like you said, looking at what's happening for the person in a whole in their environment. It's about as a whole.
I think that's true that when it comes to thinking about issues people may be having, holistic approach to addressing the issue would be considering all of those things, which I think is, for instance, my fiance is a doctor of acupuncture. And when I hear her talk about the way that she does intakes with patients, it's so holistic. Like, she asks about all these different elements of a person's life and all of those different pieces of the physical, the mental, the social, spiritual. And I like that because, like you said, it's considering the reality that all these things are related. Just because, maybe there's an idea that this is the one thing that needs to be changed to help the symptom, in reality it could be related to something else. And so I think when it comes to addressing wellness challenges, then that holistic approach is definitely important.
I wanted to touch on the different types of meditations in practice, active versus not. Because sometimes I think when people think about mindfulness, it's just, oh, I'm just sitting, sitting somewhere,
Yeah.
focusing on my breathing, pushing my thoughts out. Again, not what it's about, but maybe we could talk about what an active meditation practice is and what that looks like.
The traditional form, usually seated where you're focusing on the breath. But the other form that's pretty common is walking and bringing your attention back to the sensation of the body, specifically the feet connecting with the ground or the earth while you're walking. So I think that is a practice that it's certainly different than being seated because you're moving. A lot of times it's practiced outside and it's definitely different, but I think that it's the same core elements as a seated mindfulness meditation practice. But in terms of active, I think mindful walking, mindful yoga, those are a few that are more formally understood as traditional mindfulness practices.
Right. So mindful meditation practices can really hone in on one of the senses, right? You could do sound meditation, walking. I've done mindful eating practices where
Mhm.
people feel it enhances their experience with food and flavor. So it again is almost kind of like sharpening and really being attuned to what you're doing in that moment. And just want to ask about like leading your own mindful practice and walking. What have people noticed in doing that type of practice?
I've led a lot of mindful walks outside.
Hmm.
I think that what I hear from people a lot with that is just being silent and present in nature just is so supportive for so many people. And I hear a lot of people say they can't remember the last time they experienced a moment like that. And I think that's a really interesting piece of feedback because it, to me, says that usually whenever someone goes outside or they're walking, they always have something else they're doing. I think there's personally to me, I'm really connected with nature and the outdoors. And I think there's something really valuable about being silent in nature and just being present with nature. Being inside and just being completely present also is incredibly valuable. But I think there's something uniquely valuable about that experience outside. And I think a lot of people do have an easier time with mindful walking or walking meditation than seated mindful breathing practices because there's this movement of the body. I do hear that from a lot of people as they feel more comfortable like walking and practicing that sort of focus. And I think that for me, mindful walking is a great practice, especially outside. I do think that when it comes to developing focus, I personally find that the seated practices are a little bit, I don't want to say better, but for me, I feel like it can be a little bit easier for me to just develop a stronger focus and sense of presence. But I think there's unique value to the walking practice as well.
Definitely. And I remember completing mindful practice while taking the bus in Toronto and noticing different things that I didn't before because I'm caught up in my head of what I need to do when I get to work, etc., tasks that you're not paying attention to your surroundings. It's like I'm noticing the little baby actually trying to smile and engage while I'm
Yeah,
mindful practice, or this historical building that's abandoned, and I didn't even notice how many times I've actually driven past. So it's
yeah,
amazing how the practice can help you just be more present, even in active meditations and what you're doing and experiencing it differently.
100%. I think that's a really good point that at any moment we can tune in and consciously practice mindfulness. It's very true. Now we have the ability to constantly distract ourselves with other things. And so, even for me as a kid, a lot of those moments of just sitting in the car and just looking out the window or waiting in line somewhere and just being present with the line, those can always be avoided. And
Mm.
so we naturally miss out on so much of just life because we're just not present with it in the same way. We're consciously choosing to think or focus on something else rather than what's present with us.
Yes, little quick dopamine hits. People look at your website only for 15 seconds, right? It's just, there's so much information coming at us that it's what's typical for us and our brain is to actually be more present and aware. And we kind of notice those effects, I think, of having that bombard us on a regular basis.
Yeah, very true.
So I was wondering, and just wrapping up, you'd like to tell us more about your mindful meditation teacher program, what you've got going on, and anything else you'd like to share where people can find you.
Right now, we have our mindfulness meditation teacher training live. It's a 50-hour accredited training. It's basically going to help for anyone who's interested. It's going to help with learning these practices. A lot of people who have done this training in the past don't even have the intention of teaching. They just want to really understand these practices and deepen mindfulness in their life. The course and training are going to help regardless if you want to just deepen your practice or if you want to become a certified and accredited teacher. Yeah, in terms of that business, that's the main thing that we're focused on right now. And in the future, we're working on developing other courses and trainings in the mindfulness and holistic wellness space. And that business you can find mindmowellness.com. And then our Instagram is mindmo.wellnessco. So that's that business, family. So that's probably the best way to get in touch is just through the Mindmo page and
And your website.
the website too. Yeah, mindmowellness.com.
Great. Thanks so much for your time today, Ellis, and learning so much about mindfulness and the difference between practices that incorporate breathing and understanding the importance of being present, and the benefits of mindfulness. I look forward to hearing more about your study and further research too. And again, great things that you're doing with the mindful teaching certificate and program, and how great to be accredited. That's a big thing too. So congrats
Yeah,
as well.
thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Look forward to have you on next time on another topic.
Yeah, sounds good.